This video delves into the profound philosophical and theological idea that modern rationalism, as advanced by thinkers like Descartes and Marx, has overestimated the power of reason, especially when it becomes detached from spiritual or religious grounding. The argument is that pure reason, operating in isolation, often leads to ideological hubris, the belief that human beings can engineer a utopia through politics and logic alone. But history tells a darker story. These rational utopias often spiral into totalitarian nightmares. The speaker draws heavily from the work of Leo Strauss, who emphasized the enduring tension between two pillars of Western civilization. Athens, representing reason, philosophy, and critical inquiry, and Jerusalem, representing revelation, faith, and divine authority. The central thesis is that a healthy society and a sane individual must live within this tension. Too much reason without spiritual orientation becomes arrogant and dehumanizing. Too much blind faith without question leads to dogmatism. Together, however, they keep each other in check. The video also explores how human perception is deeply narrative. We do not perceive reality in a purely objective way. Instead, our minds interpret the world through stories, values, and goals. Therefore, having a proper aim, a higher principle or divine orientation, is essential not only for individual meaning, but for the survival of social order and constructive dialogue. Without a shared aim or a common moral horizon, society begins to fracture. Communication collapses, nihilism spreads, and chaos takes hold. Thus, the speaker concludes that modernity must rediscover the necessity of integrating both rational exploration and spiritual revelation, the harmony of Athens and Jerusalem, to preserve meaning, morality, and human dignity.
Ever get that feeling that, pure logic?
Yeah.
It doesn't quite tell the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe when we try to build these perfect societies just based on reason, we miss something fundamentally human.
Yeah, the messy stuff.
Exactly. So if that rings true for you, and maybe you want to get a solid grip on some big ideas without getting totally swamped, well, you're in the right place.
Definitely.
Because in this deep dive, we're tackling a really interesting idea. The potential trap of relying too much on reason to achieve social perfection.
Right, this overestimation.
We've got some fascinating source material here that looks at how this connects to, well, how we understand the world. And interestingly, the role stories play.
Narrative, yeah.
So our mission today is basically to figure out why that purely rational utopia might be flawed and what else is, essential for a good human life and understanding things properly.
And what jumps out right away from the sources is this warning against overvaluing reason, particularly when we think about big systems like society. The discussion points towards this, let's call it the Marxian idea, which seems to really lean heavily on reason for organizing, well, production and politics.
Okay. So this heaven on earth idea that crops up, it's like, the goal is to build a perfect society, a paradise, but right now, through politics and making stuff.
That's the ambition, yeah. Almost like taking that old religious idea of paradise, but making it secular, achievable by us.
Right.
But the critique in the material is that this kind of society doesn't just, happen organically.
It's built, engineered.
Exactly. It's a deliberate construction. The source calls it political constructivism, an attempt to engineer the ideal setup.
Okay, I see.
But the problem, as the material highlights, is that this engineering always happens at a certain time, a certain place, by particular men, as it puts it.
So instantly limited, right? It has to be producible, sustainable, fit these preset parameters decided by just a few people. How could that possibly cover everything about being human? It seems the big takeaway is that these grand plans, however logical on paper, might fail, because they just don't get the complexity, the sort of unpredictable nature of people and their local ties.
That's a huge part of it. And the discussion then hits on a really key assumption, that everyone thinks the same way, wants the same things.
Which we don't.
Right. The counterview presented is that we're actually radically local beings. Our strongest connections, the meaningful ones, are things like marriage, family, specific relationships.
And these grand rational designs just fly over that.
They often seem to, they overlook these really foundational local parts of life.
Okay, and then there's this phrase, divinization of man. What's that about?
Well, if we think we can actually create heaven on earth just through our own smarts.
It's like we're playing God.
Kind of, yeah. Elevating humanity. And that leads to assuming some central authority could actually have the massive computational power necessary to pull off the task.
Which sounds unlikely.
The source is pretty blunt, calls it preposterous.
Okay.
And building on that, the material uses this analogy.
Right, the constraints thing.
Yeah, the increasingly unlikely constraints. For this perfect system to work, it has to clear hurdle after hurdle, and each one makes it less probable.
It's a good way to show how fragile those top-down plans might be.
Very effective.
So this connects to the modern era then, this over-reliance on reason.
It seems to. The conversation brings in Descartes, his idea of humans becoming masters and possessions of nature.
Right, taking control.
And even the ambition to form our own values. It sounds like a big shift towards, well, maybe an overly human-centered view of what we can do.
A bit too confident, perhaps?
Perhaps. And this confidence apparently even stretched in early modern times to thinking medicine might conquer aging and death.
Wow. And the source notes that would have huge implications for religion, right?
Massive. If you take away mortality as a central concern, what happens to religion's role?
So the idea of splitting reason completely from religion, the source says that can lead to bad places, like totalitarianism.
Yeah, and even uses the term Luciferian hubris.
Strong words. It's pointing to a real perceived danger there.
It is. But it also looks at the flip side.
Separating religion entirely from reason.
Exactly. Which, the source suggests, can also lead to extremes, citing Islamic extremism as one example.
So the point isn't that one is good and one is bad necessarily.
It seems the point is more about balance, that a healthy human existence might need a way to navigate the interplay between both reason and, let's say, faith or tradition.
Which brings us to Leo Strauss.
Right. And his idea of the permanent questions.
Okay, what are those?
They arise from this tension he sees between Athens, that's like pure, unaided human reason, and the biblical alternative, summed up by, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
So reason versus revelation, essentially.
In a way, Strauss seems to argue for keeping that dialogue going, recognizing that both offer different, valuable ways of understanding things.
Because reason alone can't grasp everything.
That's his point. He says reason needs to operate in the light of the alternative of religion, because there are these huge mysteries, different ways of thinking that reason on its own might miss. And he even argues, there's no philosophical proof that the Bible's wrong, which really highlights how much our starting assumptions shape where we end up philosophically.
So it's not about picking a winner, but seeing the value in the tension itself.
Exactly. Strauss apparently saw that tension, Athens versus Jerusalem, as the coiled spring of the greatness of the West. He advocated for a kind of moderation that respects both.
That's really interesting.
And it connects to other things, too. The source mentions Socrates starting his philosophy after the oracle at Delphi.
A revelation.
Right. And the rabbis of the Talmud doing intense rational argument, but within the horizon of revelation.
So reason operating within a larger framework.
It seems so. Even Karl Popper's idea of falsification is mentioned as a kind of intellectual humility, knowing we can't prove everything true, only maybe prove some things false.
Okay, so we've covered the limits of pure reason.
Yeah.
Now, the conversation shifts gears quite a bit, doesn't it, towards perception.
It really does. It starts challenging the idea that we just sort of objectively see the world as it is, like we're neutral observers.
But we're not.
Apparently not. The source brings in Carl Friston, the neuroscientist,
Right.
who agrees with this idea that every time we perceive an object, it's actually a micro-narrative.
Whoa, okay. A micro-narrative.
Yeah.
So even just looking at a cup is telling a tiny story.
That's the implication. It's profound. It suggests that storytelling is baked into the very basic way we experience reality. There's always an implied goal, a starting point, a mini-journey in our minds.
Not just seeing its static thing.
No. The argument is you can't perceive anything outside of a motivational frame. And that frame is a narrative. It has an aim, a starting point, a voyage.
Okay.
So the world shows up for us as pathways towards that aim. Things that help us feel good, positive emotion. Things that get in the way, feel bad, negative emotion.
So every glance isn't neutral, it's already sorting the world.
Yes. It specifies an aim for action. Most of the world becomes irrelevant background noise. What pops out are tools, obstacles, maybe friends or foes, all relative to that aim.
And then there are these agents of magical transformation in stories.
Right, figures who can actually change our aims.
And if they change our aim?
They change the whole metaphysics, the source says. The whole way the world appears to us, the underlying rules, they shift our worldview.
Which leads to this pretty big claim that maybe the Enlightenment is ending.
It's a bold claim, yeah, because its foundation, this idea of a world of neutral, dead objects is, according to this view, just wrong at every level.
Because value is always mixed in with perception.
You can't separate them. In fact, perception might even lean towards value. It's not object first, then value added later.
And that's the terrible plague for the Enlightenment types.
It seems to be. The infinite number of objects out there. If you can't see them neutrally, you have to prioritize based on your goals and values. You're forced to choose what matters.
And that choosing is value.
Exactly. The example used is watching a movie character.
You feel what they feel.
You embody their structure of value, align with their aims, their emotions. So storytelling, from this angle, is how we share information about these underlying narratives that even our rationality works within.
Suggesting the Enlightenment's whole foundation, its metaphysics, was maybe off?
Fundamentally flawed is the implication.
Okay, so if perception is tied to narrative and aims, then the big question is, how do we find the right aim? The proper aim?
Good question. And how does having that clear aim actually help us think better, ask better questions?
Right.
And this is where the discussion circles back to ancient wisdom traditions.
Like the commandments.
Yeah, it connects finding the proper aim to the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, and also to Christ's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount.
Which are about orienting yourself.
Orienting yourself towards the highest possible good, the highest conceivable aim, and assuming others are also made in that image. That's the guidance offered.
And the idea is, if you set that high aim,
then the right path, the tools you need, the insights, the proper revelations start to appear. It actually aligns with how our perception and thinking seem to work anyway.
interesting. And the Tower of Babel story fits in here how?
As an example of misaligned aim.
Okay.
The focus isn't just the tower, but the engineers who are just baking bricks without a clear, shared, higher purpose.
Just doing the task, not seeing the big picture.
Exactly. And there's this parallel drawn to the CIA discovering LSD, this powerful tool, but then struggling to figure out what its actual meaningful use was.
Having the means, but not the proper end.
Precisely. And when aims are misaligned like that,
Communication breaks down.
yes, words lose their shared meaning because the underlying narrative substrate, the shared story that gives them context, falls apart.
Like speaking different languages because the core goals aren't shared.
That's the idea. And the source wraps this up by saying that the wisdom in the Sermon on the Mount about orienting yourself, it's anticipated by that first commandment. It all comes back to getting the aim right.
Right. So pulling this all together,
Mm-hmm.
wow, we've really gone through the potential downsides of trusting only in reason, especially for building societies.
Yeah, the overestimation problem.
And we looked at why maybe we need to consider other things, like, the perspectives from religion or tradition.
That necessary tension.
And then this huge idea about narrative and value being absolutely fundamental to how we even see the world.
Not just how we interpret it, but how we perceive it in the first place.
And hopefully, for you listening, understanding these deeper principles gives you maybe a more robust way to navigate all the information out there.
Yeah, it's not just about the facts, right? It's about the stories and the values that make those facts meaningful, recognizing that structure underneath.
Absolutely. So here's something to chew on, a final thought. How do the aims we chase, personally and as groups, how do they literally shape the reality we experience? What happens when those aims are fuzzy, or worse, when they clash? Just think about the implications of living in a world where value isn't just an add-on, but it's woven right into how we perceive everything.